Welcome to the 7th talk of our online series, Behind the Scenes Analysing Anglo-Saxon Rendlesham. I'm Alice DeLeo, the Project Delivery Officer at Suffolk County Council Archaeological Service, and today we'll be hearing from Jude Plouviez about the final years of Roman control at Rendlesham and in East Anglia. We're pleased to be hosting this online series in partnership with two projects. Rendlesham Revealed, led by Suffolk County Council Archaeological Service, funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and Lordship and Landscape, led by Christopher Scull, funded by the Leverhulme Trust. I will now introduce you to Jude. Okay, Jude Plouviez is an archaeologist who specialises in Roman Britain, particularly East Anglia. She's well known locally, having worked for over 30 years in the Archaeology Service at Suffolk County Council until 2015. During her time there, Jude was responsible for recording local metal detected finds for many years before the introduction of the National Portable Antiquities Scheme. She was also involved in various substantial excavations, including those at Hatchiston, Icklingham and Pakenham, and also managed the high-profile excavation of the Hoxton Hoard. Jude has been involved with the work at Rendlesham since the beginning in 2007 and is the Roman specialist for the Lordship and Landscape project. So Jude, when you're ready, over to you.
So far, this series of talks has largely concentrated on Rendlesham in the 5th to 8th centuries because of the huge importance of the archaeological evidence for a high-status residence here in the 7th century. However, in the first lecture, Chris Scull referred to the possible significance of the Roman background in the 4th and early 5th century. And in the second lecture, Tom Williamson raised questions about the relationship of high-status early medieval sites to the network of Roman small towns, a theme I'll return to later. To start with, I'll give a bit of background about the general Roman pattern in southeast Suffolk and at Rendlesham before turning to the specifics of the 4th and early 5th century. The exemplary metal detecting in the Rendlesham survey has produced plenty of artefacts of Roman date spanning the whole period from the conquest in 43 to the official end of Roman Britain in 409 or 410 and potentially beyond. My rather dull first slide shows the relative proportions of survey finds by period with the Portable Antiquities Suffolk finds for comparison, showing the exceptionally high relative numbers of Anglo-Saxon finds from Rendlesham, but still leaving us with nearly 1,500 Roman coins and objects to study. The archaeological evidence for the southeast of Suffolk, like much of East Anglia, shows us a mainly rural landscape of dispersed settlements, mostly individual farmsteads, many of which continued from the pre-Roman Late Iron Age, excuse me, without obvious disruption. A small minority of these farmsteads adopted Roman styles of relatively expensive architecture with hypercourse and tessellated floors, and we call these villas. There were some changes from the pre-Roman landscape. The Roman army occupied this area at the initial conquest in 43 and again after the Boudiccan revolt in 61, with an early legionary fortress just off the map at Colchester and forts at Balham Mill Coddenham up here in the Gipping Valley. The army began the establishment of the network of straight, well-built roads that linked major towns in East Anglia and beyond. Large settlements or small towns developed as market centres, commonly at places where the main roads meet or where they cross major rivers, sometimes on the site of an early fort, as at Coddenham. The Roman roads are the only landscape elements that clearly survive beyond the end of the period, in places still functioning as main roads today. So most of the roads must have continued to be used throughout the early medieval period, probably alongside systems of more local trackways, some of which were in use even before the Romans arrived. Much of our evidence for the numerous small Roman farms and settlements scattered across the landscape derives from chance finds and from individuals searching ploughed fields by field walking or with metal detectors. The systematic approach and detailed recording on the Rendlesham survey provides us with a valuable snapshot of Roman period settlement on this stretch of the Deben Valley before it became a significant centre in the post-Roman centuries. Those of you who have seen other talks in this series will have heard already about how the metal detecting at Rendlesham is exceptional in the thoroughness of the ground coverage and the accurate recording of find spots. It's worth reiterating also that the detectorists use their eyes as well as their ears, collecting surface pottery sherds when conditions were right and noting changes in the soil, such as areas of burning. This means that the absence of any evidence for substantial Roman buildings in the survey fields is very probably real. The finds plots show some potential settlements against a more general background of objects, many of which were probably spread along with manuring material across arable fields. Particular types of objects, particularly brooches and coins, can give us a good idea about when these settlements began and ended. The sites shown as south, central and north on this map follow the side of the Deben Valley. This is Deben coming round here. So you have north, central, south. They all include finds that suggest a potential pre-Roman origin, and they're certainly occupied by the time of the historical events around Plouviez's revolt and its suppression in the early 60s. Although early Roman coins are scarce, this is generally the rule in rural contexts, there are a couple of mid-1st century coins that remind us that there may have been contact with the legionary fortress at legionary colonia at Colchester, and indeed that some farms in this area could have been confiscated and handed to retired veterans from the Roman army, especially after the revolt. By contrast, the site to the east probably begins in the 2nd century. This group of finds is also in a rather different location on higher ground and a heavier clay soil, as the map shows. It may be that this was primarily a religious site, perhaps a rural shrine. The brooch on the left shows a mythological beast, a hippocamp, and it's an unusual type that might well be a votive deposit. As I mentioned, none of the Roman sites have so far produced any evidence for substantial Roman-style villa buildings, but this does not mean that they were all impoverished. On a field close to the south site, the detectorists identified a scatter of 25 silver coins as a dispersed hoard. The coins end in the reign of Marcus Aurelius in the 2nd century and show that there was at least portable wealth available locally. The low density of Roman villas around the survey area is not unusual in East Anglia, particularly in the east of Suffolk. One substantial villa has been identified at Castle Hill, Ipswich, shown here. The others shown on this map as purple triangles are based on a very variable evidence and usually lack any detail about the buildings. For example, at Farnham up here on the River Ald, just a bathhouse was excavated, with activity here seeming to stop after the middle of the 4th century. The only potential villa on the east side of the Deben, here's the Deben with Rendlesham up there, the only villa on the east side, like Rendlesham, is the crop mark of a rather small building here at Sutton, which is within a long-lived and much larger settlement complex. The later Roman period sees changes in settlement patterns throughout lowland Britain. There is some movement of wealth from the major towns to the countryside, illustrated by much lower investment in urban public buildings and many new and remodelled large villas in the countryside, particularly towards the west of England. Almost half the small settlements in rural areas disappear, perhaps sometimes subsumed into larger estates. This pattern can be demonstrated on a local scale at Ipswich, where the Castle Hill Villa flourishes and is enlarged during the mid-4th century, while several nearby farmsteads were abandoned during the 3rd and early 4th centuries. Other factors specifically affect the coastal areas. From the middle of the 3rd century, forts were established on the coasts of eastern and southern Britain, which are grouped together in the Notitia Dignitatum in the late 4th century as the ports of the Saxon shore, a gloriously ambiguous phrase. The last in situ traces of Walton Castle at Felixstowe disappeared during the early 18th century. As you can see in the print on the left, it was on the beach by 1781. And nowadays, only a single rubble lump is very occasionally visible at extra low tide, some 200 metres out from the present shoreline. Barrow Castle gives us an idea of the scale of the lost structure. As far as we can tell, the forts were originally constructed as bases for dealing with piracy in the English Channel and southern North Sea during the 3rd century. In the course of the 4th century, there are indications in the occasional historical texts that there was a serious threat of raids along the British coasts from groups outside the Roman Empire. There is a fairly good record that in 367 there were disruptive attacks on Britain by a combination of Picts, Scots, Atticotti, Franks and Saxons. There is another mention of dealing with attacks by Picts, Scots and Saxons in 398. And the final straw seems to have been further attacks on Britain in 409, when we are told that the Britons had to take up arms independently of Rome and free their cities from the barbarians who were threatening them. One way of looking at the impact on the ground of these poorly recorded historical events is by studying the large data sets of Roman coins that have accumulated as a result of metal detecting. One problem, of course, is that these can only take us to the very beginning of the 5th century over here. As no more coins arrive once Britain ceases to be a Roman province. This graph shows the system divided by Richard Rees, showing the average peaks and troughs of coins found through time in Roman Britain, with a second line in blue for Suffolk, which diverges slightly in the 4th century, but is otherwise very similar. Don't worry about graphs, you can ignore them. Good. The key difference identifiable when we examine smaller groups of coins from around Suffolk is that there is an area in the east of the county shown on this map. Don't worry about the charts in the background. But the line on the map shows where many fewer coins were in circulation and lost during the final 3 coin phases, that is from about 360 onwards. And this applies to the small towns at Hatchiston and Wenniston. Hatchiston's there and Wenniston's up there, as well as in their rural hinterland. It was therefore quite surprising to find that the Rendlesham Roman coins showed something rather different to this pattern in the late 4th century. Compared to the norm for Britain, which you see again at the top, you can see a massive rise in the final periods here. After 380, in fact this is about 380 there, it shoots up to the end of the century. Much of this rise is accounted for by a dispersed hoard of these small Theodosian bronze coins on the central site. Because the coins were in the plough soil alongside plenty of other Roman finds, the hoard is only identifiable because the find spots have been recorded, showing that there was a core group in the southwest of the field, down here. So if we take the central site out of the picture of Rendlesham coins, there are still more coins in circulation there than is normal at many other sites in Suffolk, in East Suffolk, though this would resemble the national pattern. So still something slightly odd, and there's this great lump of coins on the central site. For example, the pattern at Hatchiston dives rapidly towards almost 0 after the middle of the 4th century here. The only Rendlesham site that disappears in the mid-4th century is the possible shrine on higher ground to the east, that one over there. The 3 sites along the valley side seem to continue until at least the end of Roman governance in 409. The most prosperous looking area is the south site, where we have another coin hoard, this time a small group of silver siliquae. You'll see the various sizes of these coins showing they have been clipped to remove silver in varying amounts, some only just, like here, retaining the emperor's face, rather than keeping the legend round the outside. And this keeps the coin presumably more or less valid as currency. The clipping is a common phenomenon in final phase Roman hoards and almost certainly happened in the 10 years or so after 410. The large number of these late hoards and the deliberate clipping away of the silver coins are indicators of the general disruption in Eastern Britain in the early 5th century. The south site has also produced some characteristic late Roman objects, such as these copper alloy belt fittings. These belts were worn by men in the army or official government posts during the 4th century. The range of pieces here, although fragmentary, indicates 2 different propeller-shaped fittings and suggests that there must be several belt sets represented, and so multiple connections with officialdom in the 4th and early 5th century. The nail cleaner fragment on the bottom right, this thing, you can see illustrations of how it would look complete. It's also a very late Roman piece and quite likely worn suspended from a belt as well. So the Rendlesham survey sites show us a mixed picture in the late Roman period, but with more activity than is normal in the later 4th century in the coastal region, and with an unusual number of late bronze coins at the central site. Large assemblages of these late Theodosian bronze coins, both in hoards and as general losses, are usually found only at major towns and military sites, for example, Canterbury and Richborough in Kent and Caerwent in South Wales, and they may well reflect the presence of a detachment of troops. This perhaps leads us to look in the direction of Felixstowe and the Wharton Castle shore fort, where we certainly had troops at the mouth of the Deben, though quite why there should be soldiers from the fort so far up the river as Rendlesham is far from clear. Interestingly, there is just one other hoard of these late bronze coins recorded in Suffolk, and so far no definite examples from Norfolk. This second hoard was found at Little Beelings here, which is closer than Rendlesham to Felixstowe. This hoard consisted of over 500 coins, probably buried in a wooden box. Recently, an excavation has revealed part of a Roman settlement quite close to the hoard find spot, and the settlement continued in the post-Roman period with sunken featured buildings of 5th or 6th century date. There is another direction that we might look for some kind of transfer of local Roman authority to Rendlesham in the late 4th and early 5th century. We've already seen that the small town at Hatchiston has a marked drop in coins after the mid-4th century. That's the town of Hatchiston up there. The excavations in the 1970s identified only one structure in use in the late 4th century, far less than there were in earlier phases within the excavated area. The large brooch assemblage from Hatchiston does include several of the crossbow type, with at least one example, the gilded fragment at the bottom right, likely to have been in use after 370. This picture of General Stilicho in the late 390s shows how these brooches were worn. You can see there's the cross bit, and there it is at the bottom there, and the brooch going up there with the bit that's missing down here sticking up at the back. These were used to fasten the cloaks of high-ranking military personnel, and finds in British graves confirm the association with high-ranking men in the late 4th and 5th centuries. Late 4th and very early 5th century. Sadly, crossbow brooches are totally absent in the Rendlesham survey finds. However, it's possible that some aspects of Roman administration, perhaps including tax gathering, moved from the small town to particular rural sites such as Rendlesham and Little Beelings, and that field troops were stationed in these countryside locations rather than at the Hatchison small town during the final years of Roman rule. Looking more widely in the area of southeast Suffolk around Rendlesham, I've mapped the Roman sites that seem to show activity in the late 4th century, here with the green stars. As we've seen, there are few typical villa buildings, the outstanding example being the large one at Castle Hill, Ipswich over here. This villa at the head of the Orwell estuary and on the land route from Felixstowe, it's a road coming up this direction, is well placed for some connection to Walton Castle, Shawfort. Otherwise, at least half of the possible villas or other substantial Roman buildings, which you can see as red splodges in the background from Suffolk HER, these had fallen out of use before about 370. The distribution of late wealth, as represented by hoards of silver and gold coins, which are shown as yellow diamonds on the map, correlates with the other late farmsteads and confirms that activity continued in places into the early decades of the 5th century. But there are less than 30 of these sites within the area of the later Wicklow hundreds, compared to the very numerous early sites that records show in red in the background. These final Roman settlements are generally located on the more favourable locations along the valleys and on the good soils that Tom Williamson described in his talk. These are the more fertile soils on the sandy areas in the east and on slopes rather than on the flatter areas in between when you get onto the clay soils. And these are the areas that were more densely settled throughout the Roman period because they were the best soils for arable farming. But the other areas would mostly be used for grazing, and there certainly are occasional 1st to 3rd century sites on the more level clay lands, perhaps specialising in cattle and sheep rearing. There is a significant gap in the distribution of late sites that's not due to agricultural preference. The Lower Ald area extending southwest to Orford and Orford there, Gedgrave, Butley there, all of which have evidence for earlier Roman activity and are on good soils. Was this area abandoned in the later 4th century because it was on the coast and some distance away from the Walton Shawfort, and so at high risk from foreign raiders? It seems that there's no new settlement in this area until the second half of the 5th century. Elsewhere, there are only a handful of places where the finds seem to show activity continuing on the same site throughout the 5th century, as we've seen at Rendlesham. But this map, showing sites and finds in the middle decades of the 5th century, there's Rendlesham with a great splodge of stuff. And you can see just how thin our evidence is for the mid-5th century elsewhere. It does show that the same landscape was being exploited from so-called Roman to supposedly Anglo-Saxon, presumably by a mixture of insular and new people. In most cases, power probably moved into the hands of a new warlord elite, as suggested at Rendlesham by the appearance of ornate silver fragments from sword fittings that came in from the continent during the 5th century. In my final section, I'm quickly going to wander outside the Rendlesham and South East Suffolk area into another part of the East Anglian kingdom. In his talk, Tom Williamson discussed some of the other high status early medieval sites that we are studying as part of the Leverhulme project in terms of their landscape positions at the core of a territory, which is later reflected in the boundaries of groups of hundreds. He also pointed out that there were often Roman small towns close to these high status sites and questioned whether this was purely a coincidence of similar geographic and topographic features, or if it showed some inherited political status. This reminded me of this very simplistic map I did years ago of the small towns attributing arbitrary polygon areas to each, which did emphasise that they functioned well as market centres with almost no place more than 10 miles from one of the towns. Indeed, the Hatchiston polygon in here is not so very dissimilar from the later Wicklow Hundreds area. Although the polygons might suggest that the later elite sites are indeed simply in similar geographically determined locations, this seems unlikely to be wholly true, especially when we take into account that some towns, such as Coddenham and Pakenham, have a Roman military background, and that they all also relate to the newly imposed system of roads, being situated at crossroads and at river crossings. One of the examples of an elite site assemblage that we've studied, which has some very similar attributes to Rendlesham, was found at Hoxton in the Dove Valley, in this area to the south of the Hoxton Hoard, which is there. The area quite likely includes a large Roman estate. It's near the area, only 3 kilometres from the Roman town of Scull, and it covers 2 exceptionally large bullion hoards, Hoxton and Eye, and is also potentially the site of the Villa Faustini, named in the Antonine itinerary and generally assumed to apply to the small town at Scull, but the villa reference is very odd. One possible location for such a villa might be at Eye, where there is a rather elusive reference to the discovery of a hypocaust. During the first half of the 5th century, 2 cremation cemeteries developed near Eye. This suggests that this is also a focus of early Germanic settlement during the first half of the 5th century. Incoming peoples are also suggested by occasional find spots in and around Scull of Germanic supporting arm brooches. Here we see the most complete of the examples of this type from Rendlesham, which, as Faye noted in her talk, may be an insular version of this type with a single attachment lug at the back holding the pin, which would have gone down there. One of the small but telling changes from Roman to Anglo-Saxon cultural practices is how bow brooches, which are essentially ornate safety pins, were being worn and by whom. We saw that the latest Roman bow brooch, the crossbow, is found singly in male contexts, fastening a cloak on the shoulder. The typical Anglian style in the later 5th century inhumation burials is for women to wear 2 bow brooches holding their dress on both sides at the shoulders, often with a string of beads between them. This is one of my favourite burials. It was found in the 1990s excavation near the river's edge at Scull. It's very likely a murder victim dumped in the top of a late Roman pit and covered by pieces of timber. At the time, she was wearing 2 brooches and a small string of beads, which you can see here. One of the brooches here is again of a supporting arm type, like the Rendlesham example, having only a single lug for attachment. But to make up a pair of brooches, she also had an antique Roman brooch, probably manufactured in East Anglia before the start of the 2nd century. So this was a woman in the early 5th century, dressed in Germanic style, but using a brooch that had been out of fashion for centuries, that she had acquired locally, and she ended up in a pit on the edge of a largely abandoned Roman small town. Within this area of North Suffolk, we can surely argue for a final Roman power base somewhere around Hoxton or Eye. Although the Hoxton Hoard, which you see here, contains mainly cash and domestic precious metal items, there is also a gilt silver scabbard mouth fitting, which is top right on the slide. So this wealthy family also included a high-ranking Roman officer. The nearby elite 7th century site in Hoxton also produced some earlier finds, of which these two both look like early post-Roman pieces. The buckle on the right is another example of the late Roman form of belt fitting, but this one is a late type and rather poor quality manufacture, so it seems likely to be a local copy made after 410. The squashed gold finger ring is a very odd amalgam of pieces of Roman jewellery. The gold setting was probably from a 3rd or 4th century necklace, this bit, and it contained a 2nd century gemstone, while a well-made Roman filigree ring has been modified by flattening the ends and attaching it to the back in a very makeshift fashion to the setting. Although the individual elements could be compared to the Hoxton hoard, the end product looks like someone later on trying to emulate Roman authority with absolutely no access to comparably skilled jewellers. Presumably this was either a descendant of the Hoxton landowners in reduced circumstances or a newcomer asserting their control over the estate. So to conclude, and you can see it on the screen, and perhaps you can just read through it quickly. Basically, we've got farmsteads at Rendlesham from the middle of the 1st century. In the very late 4th century, there may have been a small detachment of soldiers at the central site, and perhaps some functions were moving from small town Hatchiston to the rural centres such as Rendlesham in the very late 4th. Many farmsteads disappeared after the mid-4th century, including most of those on less productive soils and those near unprotected parts of the coast. Whereas in central Suffolk there was much more wealth in the late 4th century, but there were similar signs of disruption and evidence for new people arriving from Northern Europe early in the 5th century.